I will be sharing with you a selection of several park ranger stories that have been shared with me. The first one is a ranger at a national park who was locking up for the night, preparing his rounds. This ranger had leaned up against his truck, finishing his cigarette before heading into the main office and switching on the security cameras and motion sensors that cover the main perimeter of the very small complex. He only had one loop to run, so he would be able to leave as soon as it was finished. There wasn't much else to see out there, even with several clearings created by past fires and an access road running along each side of them, leading to campsites at either end of the loop trail. When he looked south down the road, though, he claims he saw a lone figure standing at one of the campsites. Too short, perhaps a child, but definitely not moving like anything natural. He says that he dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. Already reaching for the radio on his belt, he headed toward the figure. Superstitions about monsters is very common in national parks, so park rangers are used to stories like that and strange reports from campers and hikers, especially when they wander into restricted areas, but never with descriptions that made them think of anything other than they'd ever investigated before. So when this particular part-time volunteer ranger reached where the figure had been standing, there was nothing but a burnt-out campfire. He glanced down to make sure the embers were out, then walked to the edge of the clearing, looking in each direction along the path. It was a very quiet night, with half-moon shining in a clear sky. No sign of anybody else around who could have been responsible for creating that campfire. Campfires in this area were strictly forbidden. This is just one of the many very strange occurrences that rangers have to deal with. Many strange reports like this come in to the park's dispatch, but most of them are clearly written off as people who are partying or drinking too much. But there are still many reports by those that cannot be explained, and I'm excited to share a bunch more with you. Stay tuned for the next email. I was working night shift when it happened. I patrolled all the little sections in the park for wildlife disturbance and vandalism in the dark. That's what most people with bad intentions come out to do. It was really quiet one night when my radio goes off, saying that there had been reports of screaming over by B campsite, right near the forest. When I have arrived, it had stopped, but the people there were still shaken up, and they had reported this loud growling and guttural sounds coming out of the trees. Of course, when I got there, they were all standing around a fire, but nobody was talking or anything. Just before their screams, which had woken everybody up, people at Campsite B said they also saw somebody running across the road in front of them, only to disappear in the brush. This had occurred between campsites A and C. They too would stop their car to investigate what was going on. It happened so very quickly, nobody could really get a good look. People from A site said something ran past them too, and started screaming. They could not tell what it was, and none of these people knew each other, and none of them had met before this trip. They were all just random folks spending a weekend at the park. So I followed the path that whatever had ran across to see if I can find any tracks or anything. It was nearly impossible. All the ground was so hard and there were lots of people milling about. The campsite for B is near a bunch of dense woods within the park, so it wasn't too surprising something made its way over there. I checked out campsite A since it was next, and the closest, wherever the paths had crossed. But again, nothing turned up. The whole experience felt really strange. Everybody seemed genuinely freaked out outside their tents, but they wouldn't talk much at all. They just kept staring into the black trees with their flashlights, looking for something, waiting for something to come out of the darkness. It was definitely eerie and extremely quiet. I kept my radio on me, thinking we would hear something, but we never did. Although the time I was there, I did not hear anything out of the ordinary that night. We went home a few hours before sunrise since most people were still awake. The next day, everybody at that campsite packed up pretty quickly, leaving as fast as they could. I guess I had heard from the overnight ranger. This campsite saw something that terrorized their tent. I haven't really heard much about it since then, but apparently whatever they saw really spooked them. It's a darn shame. I hope whatever it is does not drive traffic away. People do enjoy camping all year round, so hopefully, whatever large animal this is goes away on its own. I'm hoping it's just maybe a moose or something. That maybe these people just got spooked. It is the woods after all, and people's nerves are a lot more on end when they're out in the darkness or on things they don't quite understand. We were investigating a campsite surrounded by blood and lots of reported Bigfoot activity. As we were patrolling the area, on the lookout for any suspicious activity, we heard something heavy crawling through the brush, breaking branches as it moved. It stopped once. We turned off our lights and we could hear something right beside us. It was breathing very heavily, making strange noises. And suddenly, we see this large dark shape jumping right between my partner and I before turning around to face us. It was at least 8 feet tall, about 5 feet wide, and yellow glowing eyes in the darkness. It stared us down intensely for a moment before turning and running off into the woods after it realized it had been spotted. I don't think it expected us to be there. We searched for footprints or anything else beyond being completely terrified about what we had just seen, but we knew our job meant that we had to follow it and find out who or what it was. My partner and I just kept looking at each other in disbelief after seeing what a creature this was. Clearly, there was nothing about this that was human in any way, shape, or form. The strange part, though, is that even though we did report this incident to our higher-ups, they didn't seem the least bit concerned. But they talked as if they knew something, but weren't going to tell us. Anyway, if you manage to get your hands on any sort of Bigfoot encounters or stories, I would love to read them, try and educate myself on what it is that we saw. And don't get me wrong, my partner and I were completely horrified by this. Still am. It's still rough to talk about, but I figured I have to at least come to terms with it. We're very lucky that this large animal didn't attack us and kill us. Since about 2017, our park on Isle Royale has been getting lots of reports of Dogman attacks. Rangers, along with many of his staff, some volunteers and campers have all gone out overnight with a massive search party to see if we can find any evidence. One of the most horrific things we found being a part of the search party is we did find a mangled corpse in the ground. It was a woman in her later 30s, although too late for this poor woman. It appeared as if she had been attacked by a large unknown canine, torn to shreds, actually. I'm very well versed in information regarding the Michigan Dogman. After all, everybody talks about it in this state, and there have been numerous sightings and reports all over, from Ohio to Michigan. Mainstream science and the media won't accept it, so when these sorts of things happen, we have to write it down as a bear attack. But judging by the size of teeth and the kill, a bear did not do this. And this is not the first time I've seen a body mutilated and mangled out here. But it is the first time I've seen a body mutilated and mangled this close to the rest of the campsites. I'm hoping that this attack isn't a repeat, and that it's not going to work on getting closer and closer to the main campsites. My hope is that we can keep whatever this creature is at bay, assuming it is a Dogman, something none of my colleagues and supervisors are willing to accept. But I feel like if we want to keep park visitors safe, it's something we seriously need to talk about and consider. I work on the search and rescue as often as I can, and I have a very interesting case to share with you. I know I'm not allowed to normally discuss this stuff, but I believe that this missing case might be the work of an alien abduction. I received a call one day from a frantic mother who was calling about her missing daughter. She and her parents were camping in an area just outside of Bend, Oregon. I drove out to meet them at their campsite. The family had been staying there for a few days on this particular morning. The mother and father went down to the river, while their daughter climbed into one of the riverside trees to get a better view of the scenery. Don't worry, it was a very short tree, less than 10 feet. That is the last she saw of her. She disappeared without a trace. The mother frantically tried looking for her, but couldn't find any sign that she had fallen or ever come down from where she was. They searched all around, becoming grief and panic-stricken, and finally calling us. I arrived at their campsite, talked with the family a bit, and got some information. They showed me where they had been camping and asked about what their daughter was wearing at the time of her disappearance. They told me she was only wearing a t-shirt, short pants, and sandals. Her mother was pretty much in shock, but I tried to do everything I could to calm her down and get information from her. So I went over to the river, see if there's any clues. The whole family watched as me and my team searched along the water's edge for hours. The search continued on all day, until dark, where we expanded our search party. I could not stop thinking about that poor girl, so we continued our search more and more, but again, no trace of her at all. Even the dogs could not pick up on her scent. Over the course of the evening, the night, I should say, the helicopter had found her. She was about 12 miles north of the location in which she had originally gone missing. Completely fine, unharmed and unscathed. The dogs had her scent trail and helped lead her in the area in which we needed to find her, whereas the other search team and helicopter helped do the rest. When the girl was found and she was picked up, she was in the fetal position, rocking back and forth, murmuring to herself. Her eyes were wide, and she had this expression of complete and utter terror on her face. She wore it strongly. We asked if she was okay, but she did not reply. We got her up on the helicopter and took her safely back to her family. Her mother broke down sobbing, so happy to see her daughter. But the daughter didn't even react to seeing her mom again. She was just traumatized, wide-eyed, and her expression never changing. We tried to find out the best we could of what happened, but we never got straight answers. She just kept murmuring and saying weird things like, "It took me, it took me, it came and grabbed me. He told me not to say anything. I wasn't allowed to leave." Just strange things like that. She never gave any concrete conclusive answers for any of us on the investigation. But clearly somehow she had traveled 12 miles within the short time that she had disappeared, and she was found on a small bluff. We have no idea what picked her up, but part of me wants to think it was aliens. It's really the only thing that makes sense to me. And after my off time, really researching into alien abductions, everything kind of just ticks the boxes. But, of course I could be wrong. I wasn't saying that she's been experimented on or probed or anything like that, but she somehow was clearly transported in a very short amount of time, a distance that would have been impossible for her, because between her and the small bluff is miles and miles of very rough terrain, and in her outfit and flip-flops, it would have been impossible to do, not without getting scratched up and dirty and being that worn out. There's just no way. It doesn't make any sense. And you couple that with how she was acting and what she was saying. Someone or something took her, and it obviously had the poor girl very, very frightened. Hello. I've been working in the industry for 12 years now. I wanted to report this to you because you're the only one that really seems to delve into this strange realm of paranormal, weird and unexplained. Allow me to introduce myself quickly. My name is Jonathan, and I've been a ranger for 12 years now. I've always loved working in the forest. You see, it's very quiet, peaceful, and it feels like it's the only career path you can really be one with nature. But I've experienced some paranormal things here and there, ranging from unexplained to downright terrifying. I'm going to start this story off with what happened. I won't mention the name of the town, but I'll say that it's very old, and the only people that live out there is people that either used to live out there or people who enjoy living away from civilization completely. The majority of its population is elderly, which means when we get a call in the middle of the night, it means that somebody probably died. This time was different, however, because it was not an elderly person who died. It was two hikers. Two college students, to be exact. They were trekking through the woods when they stumbled upon a large tree that had managed to fall over on them, but was wedged between several other trees. Now, even though we wrote it down as the tree fell on them, I'm going to tell you what really happened. The witness that I interviewed said she had watched them go up about 10 feet before turning around to head back to town, and she sees this massive canine leap out of nowhere, attacking both of them. It drug one of the girls off, but ripped the other girl right in half, spilling out her innards on the tree below. When my partner and I went out there together, we found their bodies less than 100 feet away from each other, which is why we had to write this down as a tree fell on them. It just makes the paperwork easier. Now, no trace of this creature or canine was ever found. Their bodies and faces were so mangled, recognition was nearly impossible. We had to use dental records to do it. This was also very close to town, and in view of a lot of the community, which is why we had several witnesses. Personally, I have no idea what could have done this or why it happened, but I know one thing's for sure. Seeing a young woman like that ripped apart by something like, I don't know, a werewolf, really does a number on you. Anyway, I hope this story was enough to convince you that the woods aren't always exactly safe. Take it from a guy like me who works in this job field. I see it and experience it a lot more than we're allowed to talk about. This, unfortunately, is a job that's filled with tragedy a lot of the time. We believe and suspect that a man had got lost and disorientated, making a wrong turn, sometime during the middle of the night, falling to his death after trying to climb up almost a sheer cliff. We had found his backpack about 20 yards from where he had passed, but there were no clues as to where his body might have gone. It's like he just vanished into thin air. We're not sure how long his body had been there, or if maybe he was killed, but we found no signs of animal interference. A ranger who asked to remain nameless claims they heard the man screaming during the night while they were near the scene. When they decided to check it out, they found nothing. I know this sounds crazy, but I do think something happened. When we arrived at the scene, all my dog would do was whine and stare at the rock wall. He didn't bark or anything like he normally does. It seemed like he wanted me to follow him, so I did. We ended up having to climb the steep cliff face with almost zero holds in order to get the man. That's if the man was actually there, though. He wasn't. We could only speculate that the man fell to his death, hence the blood in his backpack. But then there's the question. Where's his body? Why is it gone? I'm not really a believer in ghosts, but let me just say that right now. However, I saw something that I cannot explain one night while working the night shift as a ranger. I was patrolling a very wooded area, a very popular camping spot. This was in central Illinois. I won't tell you the park name. It's always been weird to me because this place is usually packed during the day, but at night, it's different. Not that many campers stay overnight here. So this was right around 1:30 in the morning, and I had just started my second round of patrolling, when I see this tall, dark figure standing near an old cabin on one of the trails. And for whatever reason, I thought it was a mannequin somebody had left out here for a prank, just because of the way it looked and how still it was. I got closer, and realized I was wrong in my judgment. It was moving. Very slowly, though. But as soon as I shined my light on it, it didn't have a face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing. It was just this dark silhouette with what appeared to be arms and legs and looked just like a human. Only in shape, of course. It was completely black. The figure also appeared to have some sort of cloak or cape draped over him or her. So obviously, I'm trying my best not to panic. My mind is racing with possible explanations for this thing. Perhaps some mischievous college students dressed in cloaks, playing a prank. Perhaps I'm hallucinating. Either way, it's creeping me out and I want no part of whatever this thing is. But before I can turn around and walk away, or run for that matter, this thing picks up speed and begins to run towards me. This thing gets about 20 feet from me and leaps up about 30 feet into the air, up into the trees, like some sort of wild animal. And now I am freaking out and panic is setting in. I'm obviously not dealing with a regular person. This is something else entirely. And like some wild, crazy animal, it's jumping around on all fours from tree to tree, following me, keeping parallel with me as I'm running back to my truck. I run as fast as my legs could take me, but found myself near the campground's entrance, where I made a break for my truck, jumping inside and locking the door behind. I just sat there in silence for about 3 to 5 minutes, trying to catch my breath, thinking to myself, I hope that thing leaves. I was too afraid to even shoot at it, and I had no idea how am I ever going to report this. I mean, number one, who's going to believe me? And number two, my up-aboves are probably going to mock me and ridicule me. I could even lose my job if I reported such a thing. Or maybe they even speculate that I was on drugs. So I kind of just sat there and sank in my seat, not sure how I should go about telling about this. This was easily one of the creepiest and most paranormal things I've ever experienced on the job. I never saw it again after that. Thank God. In the dark depths of the Pine Barrens, I was working alone in the park one night when my radio came to life. This is right after a fellow ranger told me about seeing a strange orange light above the trees right around 2 a.m. the previous week. His story kind of freaked me out, so naturally, I was a bit nervous myself, patrolling the night woods. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to keep my radio on with low volume so I could hear chatter coming over the airwaves. Now, I had my dog at my side, an older German shepherd named Sasha, trained in search and rescue. She was a very loyal companion, even though she couldn't do much more except keep me company. We patrolled for about an hour when my radio came to life again with reports of something attacking hikers just outside on Route 563. I had parked the vehicle along the road, hiked into that section of trail, armed with nothing but a pistol, 2 canisters of pepper spray, bear spray, my flashlight, and Sasha by my side, who was now on high alert, and whatever courage I could personally muster up. We walked for nearly 5 minutes on the perimeter of the woods. Sasha kept sniffing at the air, whining. Something was definitely on her mind. Suddenly, she let out a yelp and took off into the brush, and without warning, I had to use all my strength to hold onto her leash as she dragged me through briars and thorns until she stopped dead in her tracks, almost 100 feet away from where we were. I could not see her, but I could hear her growling and whimpering. I managed to get a glimpse of something. It was big and moving really fast. At this point, both of us were terrified. Sasha's fur standing straight up on edge, and my heart pounding so hard against my chest, I thought it would burst at any moment. My radio squawked yet again. We've just received another call about an attack near the South Lake in the Pine Barrens. The volume was down low enough that I could only hear it just clearly. I told myself that whatever it was must have been close. And knowing my luck, which exactly wasn't running high at the moment, I would run into this thing. And then I heard the howling, right off to my right. Sasha had already begun going crazy, yelping and growling like mad, while I did the only thing I felt could save us. I whistled for her. We both took off in a full sprint away from this thing, Sasha leading the way, and being so much faster than I at this point. Every time we stopped moving, it would begin chasing us, and I lost sight of Sasha in the darkness, but kept on running through the briars and bramble, trying to come up to her. I had fallen into some briar, where my ankle swelled up really bad, and I was bleeding. And what's worse, I could hear something very big, trailing behind me. I reached for my radio to let dispatch know what happened. It was gone. Sasha's leash and collar were there, but no radio. I looked around frantically in the dark of the night, until a howl and growl both came down below, right where I just was. That growl is 100% confirmation that I did indeed see something back there, that I could not wrap my mind around. It sounded like a very large wolf, but I wasn't exactly sure. Any doubts about this creature's existence had completely evaporated in my mind, as what I can only imagine as a monster became a nightmarish reality. Luckily for me, I found Sasha and retreated back to my vehicle. It seemed that the attacks had died down and whatever creature this was, which I'm pretty sure was not a normal wolf or bear, had disappeared entirely. Luckily, I never saw it, but this experience is still fresh in my mind, even though it's been years. I have never felt so uneasy at my job before. I'm never going back in that section of woods again. Not my own story, but one of my colleagues, actually. A ranger who's been doing this a long time. He told me about an incident while escorting some Boy Scouts out of the park at dark. To get them to their cars, he had to cross a creek that was roughly 4 feet deep and just over 3 feet wide. As he approached the water's edge with his flashlight, there were large sounds from both sides of him, growling. From up in the surrounding cliffs, it sounded something like a big bear and a wolf, but much deeper. He told me it was the scariest thing he's ever heard, even though they weren't exactly close. He knew whatever it was sounded big, and it was not going to let him pass without taking a swipe at him, or potentially chasing him off. So, he angled his flashlight beam to light up the water's surface, shouted at the boys crossing, "Stay away from the edge of the creek. Hurry, or we'll be here all night." They got across safely by jumping, and as soon as they were out of sight, he heard a loud crashing sound in front of him. He kept shining his light straight away, but never saw anything. He got the gist that whatever it was trying to stay hidden in the darkness. He didn't think much about it, though, until a few years later when I asked if he's ever seen anything creepy while after dark. He said no way whatsoever. I've been doing this for years, and there is something very spooky about that stretch of land, especially past sunset. In fact, that following summer, yet another ranger was going to check on a family, which was a mom, dad, and son, all hikers, and he thought they were still out near the same area. When he got close enough to their campsite, he saw all 3 sets of tent footprints coming across the creek, but only one set going back into the woods. He found them all dead, and he had to write down that it was an attempted mauling by a bear, but they had been partially eaten on. That's the ranger that I was emailing you about prior, who had sent me a photo taken up at sunset. Even that Boy Scout troop leader said what he saw resembled what looked to be a large wolf, and he believes it's the infamous Michigan Dogman. Anyway, you really don't want to go camping in these parts at night. The woods just are not really safe anymore. I can tell you from memory, it was roughly midnight or 1 in the morning. I was right around the area near Lolo Pass. It was my first time working in this particular district, so it made me very nervous, knowing about all the recorded sightings and weird experiences everyone had been having before. It's pretty isolated out here, so even if something strange doesn't happen, you're definitely inclined to hear or feel something. So you can't even get cell service there. You feel very secluded if anything happens to your vehicle or yourself while out on patrol. This is a place where Bigfoot has been sighted too many times, but to not give it the respect it deserves, from a safety standpoint. So, anyway, I had already radioed back to dispatch at HQ earlier that evening, saying I was going to be checking up on some pull-offs between mile marker 44 and 42, right along Highway 12. Quite a few people have seen Bigfoot in this area. It's pretty much just bushy and a lot of thicket on both sides of the highway. It also definitely gets very, very dark out here at night. So there I am, driving down the road and minding my own business, and my radio starts to have issues. I heard voices, but they were garbled and breaking up. There was nobody else out on patrol with me, though, so I thought maybe other rangers were trying to talk to me, but then I realized they aren't saying anything. It's just static noise coming through that kind of sounded like words. Then, all of a sudden, this piercing noise comes out over the normal background, and I blacked out for what felt like seconds, but was probably more like a minute. Somehow I didn't crash the truck. I remember how it felt like, that I was stuck in time and could see myself sitting in the car, driving. But it's like I was looking at everything through a foggy lens. I quickly snapped back into reality. It felt very disorientating, almost dreamlike. And then, when I came to my senses, I realized that all this had happened while my patrol vehicle was still moving up the road. I tried to contact HQ again, but the garbled noise stopped for good after that moment, and my radio went back to normal. So did my headlights. Everything was fine again. There were no signs of any deer on the roads or anything around here, where you would normally expect them to be. This area is heavily populated in deer, and they're always out at night. So to not see any, very strange. That made me confused and in turn got paranoid. I just wanted out of here, ASAP, so I tried not to spend too much time investigating. The next day when I was filling out my reports in dispatch, one of the other rangers who had already worked in that district for a long time told me about this phenomena he called radio fade. He said it happens all the time when you're out there. It's ghost territory, which is basically anywhere there's been Bigfoot sightings activity before. He says the electricity in the air is just different. Your radio starts acting weird and goes black for periods of time. You also feel like you'll black out too. He's had times where he's gone out there and his blood sugar has randomly spiked. He's fallen unconscious, or feels like his nerves and feet and hands are on fire. Strange stuff, really strange. You're alone and you probably won't notice it, even though it sounds like someone or something is trying to talk to you through the static noise. It's really just interference that mimics voices. If you're with somebody else, though, they might not notice it as much as you, because it feels like time goes by differently when this happens, and you aren't sure how long the blackouts will last for. All the sensations are very bizarre, not to mention something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Well, the day after this was pretty uneventful. Nothing had happened, but I've heard multiple accounts of other rangers too having very strange experiences out there in that same spot, between mile marker 42 and 44. Even other people who do search and rescue, where they have to be in that area and radio in. They also have reported strange radio chatter and blacking out. The only logical explanation that I could possibly come up with for such a phenomenon would be a magnetic field disruption, or to some other natural effect. That's the only thing, because there's nothing else that's going to interfere with the frequency of our brains and bodies, or just the energy around us, other than a magnetic field interruption. I don't know if that's synonymous with Bigfoot activity, but there's definitely something going on. Unfortunately, there's no way to prove something like this one way or the other. It's very odd though, and makes me think twice before I go out on patrol alone after sundown. I'm not sure what really happens to people who get blacked out by whatever that noise was. I think the best way to describe it is like being caught in a time warp or something. But I could be wrong. Overall, I have not had any other experiences like that night, out near the mountain. Certainly nothing as terrifying as what happened there the year before I started working. Let me get into that. So, I was just finishing up my last week of training in another district when this guy came into our office looking for advice. He and his friends were planning on hiking up a timberline lake, which is already known for having Bigfoot activity. But they said their main reason for wanting to go there was somebody had posted weird photos of sticks arranged in strange patterns, inciting that there was Bigfoot evidence. They asked if anything strange like that has happened in the area, and I knew from past reports that rangers always talked about weird things being found up there. So I just told them to be careful if they did decide to go. Although, it wasn't until a week later, when my training was finally over, I began working at Timberline, where I heard what had happened to them. They left the trailhead one night after it got dark. They thought going early would let them beat all the snow and were getting, but only made it a mile or two before turning back around because of how difficult it was trying to navigate across fresh snowdrifts, especially that high up the mountainside. The next morning, a ranger out on patrol noticed something strange ahead of him, down below, all while he was driving up the access road. When his truck got closer, he saw that there were footprints. It was a giant bare foot, but it didn't look like a bear or anything else native to the area. due to how large, deep, and far apart the tracks were spaced. It looked more like somebody wearing boots, with about an extra 2 feet of depth across each step from what you would expect from someone's actual foot size. Plus, there were only 3 toes on each side, which is very unusual for any living creature, or anywhere else, mind you. Most have paws and several toes. Anyway, the ranger carefully followed the prints all the way to the near timberline lake, where they just stopped out of nowhere, as if somebody had just taken flight. The ranger tried to follow the tracks back, but it was impossible because they had already been covered with snow at that point, so he called in help from other several rangers, trying to get clues on the types of feet print that were there. They walked around Timberline Lake for hours looking everywhere, but could not find anything, until they checked down at the water's edge near one of the wooden boat docks, and there were more along the embankment, and they stopped abruptly again. This is where they found very weird stick formations, like the same kind you would see in movies like the Blair Witch Project, but on a much larger scale. They just kind of appeared out of nowhere and were very, very creepy. After this, the other rangers and I spent a lot of time walking around this area, but we never found anything else. We could not figure out why somebody would have been wearing boots so big for hiking up the mountain during wintertime, although they looked more like human tracks, or whether they could have possibly come from or gone without leaving any more tracks wherever they disappeared towards. Nothing made sense. It was also weird because there were no other prints leading up to those ones from anywhere near the trailhead, which meant whoever made those had walked all the way up from somewhere down below on flat ground, where there should have been plenty of other footprints instead. It's still a big mystery as far as I know, unless it might be one of the other rangers or park service or another law enforcement group who has been trying to mess with us, but that's very unlikely. The other weird thing is, whoever was walking around leaving those tracks would have to have been considerable weight, considering the indent in the snow. And then, of course, there was a report from a young woman whose son refused to go into a certain part of the state forest. He was so scared by what he saw in there. And she said his story kept changing whenever she asked him what made him afraid in the first place. He claimed he saw something big walking around, staring at him. But it wasn't a person, like a man or a bear, but claimed it was walking on 2 legs. Did not look like any type of animal he had ever seen before. Sometimes he kept saying that whatever it was had very long arms and legs, but virtually no neck. And his parents even took him to see the local doctor, who kind of did an exam on him but found nothing wrong. Look, I'm not really sure what to make of all this either, but as you've seen, things get pretty crazy out here on the job. And I myself am still very unsure of what to believe and what not to believe. Everything seems so surreal, and to be honest, truth is stranger than fiction. I was part of the search and rescue for a while, but that job changed. I became a park ranger and went to the Forest Service for that. Well, one day, I was out with my buddy, whom we'll call Jake. He's a fellow ranger, but a newbie. We had been told of some strange activity around this area right before our shift had begun. One of us had asked if they could give us more info on it or anything to go off of. There really wasn't much to go off of. On our way out of patrol, something happened that still gets me sick thinking about. We were riding along in the truck one minute, just talking about stuff, when we came up to some footprints near the road. These got our attention, and naturally so. The tracks were humongous, crossing into the woods across from where we were driving down this back road. I stopped and got out to see what they were, which, was a dumb idea if you ask me. Jake stayed in the truck, watching where I went. We couldn't talk because of radio silence and the fact that we had to be quiet, listening for anything unusual at all times. The tracks looked like they belonged to some large animal. They reminded me of those found near Coyote skinning sites, or something similar. I'm not saying skinwalkers exist, but it just seems strange with all this stuff going on, as well as these prints being so close to the sighting reports we had received earlier that day from dispatch. We made note of them and left them alone. But we followed our usual patrol route, moving further away from the road until we got to an area where some cabins were located. That's when we heard this whooping sound that was echoing off in the trees around us. It sounded like it was coming from all around, not just one direction or area, but omnipresent, everywhere at once. It was coming through the woods and bouncing off of things, making it sound everywhere. We stopped to see what kind of animal could make this type of noise and still have so much echoing going on at the same time. I looked over at Jake, who had his rifle promptly aimed in every direction, looking for whatever could make that noise. Obviously spooked by this thing they knew wasn't normal. I looked back just in time to see red eyes glowing at me from roughly about 100 feet away through the trees. I could tell it was looking directly at us. It made me freak out even more than before. The creature then dropped down on all fours, began moving towards us fast, like nothing you would ever want to go up against in real life, or death. I knew that thing wasn't any kind of animal either. It didn't move right, for one thing, and its red eyes were glowing like some sort of monster out of a movie, and it seemed like it was attached to some sort of demonic monster, as we could see its shape start to form as it came out of the trees. Jake looked over after seeing the eyes too, let off a shot, hitting it in the shoulder. It was kind of hard to tell in the dark, but it looked like it might have gone down, or if anything, disappearing into the woods without making another sound. It vanished like it was never there. I told Jake to get ready for this thing to come back, as it screamed at us and let out this hellish howl, coming from the same kind of creature. What were we dealing with? We tried to search for it afterwards, looking for any blood trails or tracks, along with anything else we can find to explain this thing. But we came up empty-handed, no matter how long we stayed out there searching. That's when we finally got the word out to get out there and get back to the station as quick as possible. Something was going on with dispatch that could not be explained to anyone. We never talked about this again or brought it up. But I know Jake still gets a little freaked out, even now, thinking back to it. Even after all this time has passed, not counting those things he saw before getting me involved in any of this. I didn't believe him at first, but I knew what he saw wasn't normal, especially after hearing that awful noise coming from nowhere, like an animal that nobody would want to run into. It could have been anything, as far as we knew. But I knew it wasn't good. This thing was going to come after us. Knowing whatever was out there probably knows I work here now, and it makes me nervous wondering what will come next. I know that this isn't going to attack this place since every time it showed up, we were always armed and prepared, but maybe we'll make the mistake of going out there unarmed one day, being vulnerable and caught by this thing. I had received reports of a bunch of noise at the far northeastern section of the park. I was personally called to investigate myself. I brought it to the ranger in charge at the time. He agreed it would be a good idea for me to go out there during patrols. I took it upon myself to join the other ranger on patrol that evening. The reports were something of screaming at them from behind the trees, along one stretch of road near the campsite, for several nights in a row. It was described as sounding vaguely human, but also not human. There were 2 male witnesses. I made it my mission to speak with them myself when we get into that section of the park. It was getting dark by the time we reached where they had been camping previously. It seemed like it might take us a little while to find any evidence since it had been about 3 days since those initial reports. The ranger I was with, whom we'll call Frank, we split up. He headed off to the left, and I headed off to the right, where it seemed like there would be less dense vegetation. I continued walking, calling out intermittently, hoping to find somebody, assuming they were behind the screaming. I would call back every few minutes, and Frank replied, saying once he was on his way back, but found nothing so far. I got about another 200 yards in, when all of a sudden, it sounded like something nearby had crashed through some brush, running. Now, normally, this wouldn't have been an issue, except it sounded like a very large biped coming towards us. I immediately started heading back in the direction of the vehicle, not really wanting to see what was coming. It didn't take a genius to realize that what it sounded like was coming for me. Once I heard this, I did my best to outrun what could turn out to be a bear or maybe a mountain lion, or maybe worst of all, what others had considered a Sasquatch previously, before departing from camp that night. Frank had joined me just as we reached our vehicle, parked roughly 80 yards away from where he'd been searching when he responded earlier. By this point, there were loud noises everywhere around us, making it impossible now to hear each other without speaking very loudly. The forest was alive with these screams. I quickly suggested we get back into the vehicle. We immediately started driving back towards base ops, which was about 15 minutes away from where we were currently stationed on patrol. My heart was racing the entire time. The forest and the night were alive with these creatures, or something, going on. I was told to write up a detailed report of what had happened to us out there, and even give detailed sketches of the creature that I saw that night, even though I barely did. Frank, however, was questioned. He had very well seen the creatures I did not see. Between the fear and the shaking, it took quite a bit of time for him to convince himself that he was not hallucinating. He did indeed see something dangerous. This was all eventually resolved when we decided and were told not to talk about it. I think we as rangers accepted that there might be some theories about the mythical Bigfoot, and that they are indeed a reality. Of course, this only led to more questions and speculation than actually having fruitful, full answers. Let's just say we finished our patrols without incident after that, and shared stories of other strange things happening. I'm pretty sure that made believers out of us, at least it did for me. Greetings, Reddit. I recently had my very first sighting of a cryptid. I was working at a national forest as a camp host and got the job temporarily full-time. I was to replace a maintenance worker for a couple of weeks while he went away on vacation. In the meantime, I got up bright and early, go out on a run, come back to the cabin I currently live in at the campground, and got dressed for work. A couple of days before the incident at hand, I ran into a young woman as she was leaving her campsite. She said that she had just arrived and woke up to a strange noise in the middle of the night. I find myself driving down a lower road, used for maintenance workers, and I approached a clearing with a dirt berm on one side. It is there that I hit something with my truck, and it nearly threw me out of my seat. Once I regained composure, both mentally and physically, I hopped out of the truck to see what it was. What appeared before me was not man-made, at least not by human hands. Jumping back into my truck, I did a quick 3-point turn and went back to camp. It was there that I grabbed my rifle from the cabin door, strapped it into the gun rack in the truck, and drove onto the dirt berm. As I got out of the truck, at about 100 yards from where I hit it, whatever it was now standing up on two legs with its arms held straight up in the air, like it was reaching. My first thought was that this was a werewolf or some sort of Bigfoot. I did what anybody would do in this situation. I raised my rifle and fired one round directly at the thing's head. The bullet hit true, right between the thing's eyes, killing it instantly. Standing there for a few seconds, looking around, thinking just how lucky I was that nobody else had come across this thing, only to get back in my truck and go about my day. That night after work, when I got back to camp, I took a shower before dinner. The next day when I got to work, my coworker came to ask me if anybody else saw what I hit the other day. Of course, I asked why he wanted to know. He told me an officer from the sheriff's department stopped by and was asking if anybody had gone out to that clearing and hit anything with their vehicle. When I told him about my incident, he told me he would talk to the officer for me. I have a bad feeling about this. I'm a park ranger in the United States government, and I deal with a lot of strange things. In fact, just this last week, my dispatch got a call from a woman who was hiking along with her boyfriend. They had seen something they could not explain along the Grizzly Ridge Trail. She described it as an animal that was bipedal, walking on two legs. They were able to see its arms and legs, but they reported it did not have a tail or any fur. I never heard of anything like that before, so I was called out to investigate this sighting myself. Well, I found something all right. I saw something walking across the stream with one leg in the air, almost like it was kind of walking weird. Like it would take these giant strides, with one leg in the air, followed by the other. Almost like it was bounding across the stream. Maybe it was a coyote at first, but everything about this just did not look right. The reason why I thought this was due to the very wolf-like appearance of the head, and eyes that appeared to almost glow in the moonlight. It was roughly 6 to 7 feet tall, if I remember right. It was pretty dark. I thought I was seeing things at first, but after making sure this thing was real, I pulled out my G22 and shot at it. The thing did not even flinch. I tried to aim for its heart, or lungs, but the rounds just seemed to bounce off its body. My first thought was this had to be some sort of military experiment gone wrong. The thing just stared at me, but it left after that. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was too afraid to go back into the woods for days after, even though it's my job. This month, things have been really crazy around here. Even animal control had been called me out to deal with a pack of canines or something in the park, ever since mid-June. They would be hunting livestock all over town, and now they've entered in here. I just can't get what I saw out of my head, though. It haunts me every minute of the day. Up until now, these strange things had only seemed to be isolated. But were they? Now I'm hearing reports of these things happening and popping up everywhere. Maybe there's a connection. I've been a ranger for a while now. I've seen a lot of crazy things, and most of it's classified, and I can't talk about it. I'll tell you about one, though. I was driving my patrol car down the highway, and I received a call over the radio that really freaked me out. They had reported that somebody had said their friends were being attacked by something at one of the campsites. I drove over as fast as possible to see what was happening. When I arrived, I saw several cars parked around the campsite where everybody seemed very nervous about everything. The people who were supposed to be camping here weren't anywhere to be found, but they had left behind all their belongings, so it did not seem like they packed up and went home for anything like that. A couple of them were huddled together. They informed me that something very large had attacked them while they were sleeping, and it must have taken one of their friends away. I kept my gun close on me, looking around for anything suspicious. I noticed some very large footprints on the ground, along with some bloodstains leading into the woods. The footprints belonged to what many people call Bigfoot, even though it's not like any Bigfoot I've ever seen. It was one of the really big ones. This couldn't have possibly been a bear. I didn't see any of the claw marks or teeth marks anywhere. But more importantly, just the massive size of the footprints alone were what were startling. I got the call on radio for backup, but nobody was answering me. I thought maybe they were busy with something else that must have been preventing them from helping. Then I hear a scream off in the distance. It sounded like there were people yelling for help over at another campsite. At this point, I could not wait any longer. I sent somebody back to their car to get a rifle, while I continued on down the path leading into the forest with blood. When I made it to where the screaming was coming from, what I saw will never leave my memory. Whatever I was looking at had to have come from hell. It had 3 eyes and looked almost like a human, but covered in nasty hair. I can't really describe it to you, but I have never seen anything like this before in my life. There was a family who were having a camping trip with their kids, and now they were all gone. The creature had taken all of them. I decided to shoot at it quickly, but I know my bullets would not even slow it down. Whatever this thing was, it could not be killed by normal means. I don't usually talk about my job around other people, but how could I not tell people about what I saw? At least those willing to listen. It was easily one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced in my entire life. After that day, there were not many reports of unexplainable events happening around these campsites. It's almost as if they kept it as nothing happened at all. I was told to stop patrolling this area after I saw what it did. Not because I'm afraid of this creature, but it's just because of what happened. I'm told that I need to keep very quiet about these things. And if I speak up, well, more than my career will be on the line. I always try to be on high alert, but this is not only because I'm often in the woods, but that I'm also often by myself, and people are known to do some pretty dumb things out here. I want to be out here to keep them safe. For the most part, this is routine. People, though, for the most, are generally well behaved when they're out camping, but sometimes things can get weird. On this occasion, it started off as normal enough. I was by myself, patrolling the campsite during the night, not really expecting anything to happen. I was looking up at the sky, and I saw something that caught my attention. Whatever it was moving along the tree line. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was maybe some sort of animal or bird. But as I watched, it became clear that it wasn't an animal at all. This was some sort of hideous creature. Probably not an animal I've ever seen before. It was tall and gaunt, long arms and a very thin frame. I could make out some sort of hair, but it was too dark to determine this thing's color. It had a long snout, like that of a wolf or a dog, eyes that glowed dimly green. Its legs were incredibly long, and so the stride was almost comical as it walked away. I was terrified beyond belief by its sight, but I didn't want to show myself until it came closer. Even though this thing seemed to be headed towards the campsite, I couldn't leave everybody at my sight vulnerable. I waited until about 10 feet from the camp before I stood up from my hiding place, firing a shot into the air. It stopped dead in its tracks, as if it were confused as to what I was doing. I think it also realized how there was humans at this campsite now, and we were all very vulnerable. It paused for a moment, before it turned and ran back the way it came, towards the tree line. I fired another shot, but this one missed. I was too panicked to aim properly, and it got away with whatever mischief it had in mind. I woke up the rest of the campers, told them what had happened. I only saw it for a few seconds, but it's burned into my memory like a brand. That thing, whatever I shot at, was pure evil. I never went out patrolling alone at night, ever again after this. One evening, my radio had kicked in with someone else reporting that they had seen the same thing I had, something that I'll never forget. This thing that I saw scared me half to death, that's for sure. I was working in the evening shift, patrolling the watershed, keeping an eye out for people who may or may not be illegally fishing. I was hiking up along a creek. This creek feeds into a river, and I saw a large, dark, furry thing by some trees across from where my patrol vehicle was parked. It stood as still as a tree, its arms raised slightly at its sides, like it was sniffing the air and stretching. It had to have been over 8 feet tall, judging by where it was standing by a tree, and built like a linebacker, wide shoulders and chest tapering down to its slender hips. I could see muscles tensing along its legs as it crouched slightly. I was startled and immediately thought of the people I had encountered on duty before, usually drunk kids and groups of teens getting rowdy around campfires. But this time, this was something entirely different, something inexplicable, and all alone out here in the middle of nowhere, with no backup. I didn't think. I froze in place, hoping that it had not seen me while I studied the bushes where it was crouching, waiting for it to move again. That's when my radio started buzzing with the other rangers, reporting seeing the same thing. That's when this thing took off running full speed into the woods. I could see along the side of it where I was standing on top of a hill overlooking the river valley. It disappeared quickly behind some trees, ran like nothing I'd ever seen before. Powerful strides, moving its legs back and forth in giant leaps, up through the hills towards town, but not before stopping long enough to look straight at me, without ever slowing down. It had green eyes that shined bright in the night. I was terrified from this, and I still have no way to explain what sort of animal this was. As a search and rescue officer, it is our duty to search and conduct every day. It was just another normal day as I patrolled back and forth, searching for anything unusual. So many days it's the same boring routine. And just as I was thinking this, I heard something. I wonder if there was anything else around me, because as I got closer, I could tell it sounded like a man screaming for help. This was my chance to make a difference. The more I followed the sound, the more I could really tell it was a man screaming for help. When I found him, he was crouched down on his knees, covered in mud. It looked like he had not eaten in days and appeared torn and beaten. He screamed at me to help him. And then he began sobbing, explaining that something large and hairy grabbed him out of the woods and took him here. Told him that if he left, it would kill him. Then he informs me it's watching us right now. And right at that moment, I started to hear this low, rumbling growl come off from the woods close by. This is the moment where I literally pooped bricks. As I reach down for my sidearm, I see this massive shape jump out of the trees, swoop down at this man, pick him up in one full swoop and disappear off into the trees. The only sound that carried was him screaming, now becoming more faint in the distance, till it completely ceased. All happening within 5 seconds. Clearly, we were dealing with something we were outmatched. I immediately radioed for backup, and unfortunately, they weren't much help. They told me it was already being worked on, and that I was to not talk about it or deal with it. In fact, I was let go. They informed me I would no longer be handling this investigation, and even threatened my job if I talked about it. Well, here I am. So that's why I'm reporting this anonymously. I'm sorry this is so long, but there are things out there that are going on that people are not talking about. Things like this, where people are disappearing. That poor man, I don't even know if he's still alive, or whatever became of it. And I can't say for sure what that thing was that grabbed him. Was it a Bigfoot? I don't know. It moved far too quickly for me to ever know for sure. I believe that back when I was a younger ranger, I saw, myself, what many would refer to as a Bigfoot. I was currently working as a seasonal ranger for the Forest Service. I was assigned to patrol the Tombaji River, which is in the Pickens County. Now, normally this kind of thing you keep hush-hush about, but talking about it more or less just kind of helps ground in the reality of it all. I just feel like this tremendous weight on my shoulders if I don't share it. So first, let me give you some background information on myself. According to friends, family, and fellow rangers, I am an overly cautious person. Other rangers could be caught speeding while patrolling their routes, or even not wearing all their proper equipment. Even though they would get away with taking shortcuts. I'm not that kind of person though. Every time I go to work, I bring everything I need, and make sure I have double. But even being overly cautious was one thing. This still did not prepare me for what I saw that day. That morning, I woke up to do the usual routine, making my coffee, eating breakfast before heading out on a long ride. It was nice weather. Being in camping clothing was not a big deal. I always go through all these different scenarios in my head before going off into the field. What if I catch somebody fishing without a license? What if there's an accident on the water and somebody needs help? What if somebody is trying to steal something? If it's something small, we can handle it. But anything major more than one person, we call for backup. I am working with another ranger by the name of Kelly, and I told him it would be a few minutes before my ride showed up, so we started out patrolling. We make our way through the first 2 launch ramps without any issues. That's when something moves alongside the river. I asked him if he saw that. We're about 80 yards away from where we were, and there's this large figure standing at the edge of the embankment down into the water. It didn't appear to be like a normal person. Its head and body looked 3 times the size, and it had this rustic reddish-brown fur. The closer we got, though, the more we could realize it was not a person. It quickly turned to face us as it heard us approaching. That's when we could see that it had horns on its head, glowing eyes. This thing looked like some sort of hairy demon. It did not make a sound, though, and took off like a flash across the bank, off into the timber. I about nearly pooped my pants, and Kelly starts asking frantically behind me, "What? What is it? What did you see?" And I just remember telling him, "I'm not sure, we need to find out." Just as we're getting ready to check things out, Rangers with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement show up, asking us what we saw. There was something in those woods with us that day, but it wasn't until the next day, when I finally got a chance to go back and check things out, I realized how close I actually came to death. I spoke to some of the rangers once I got off work. They told me what had happened. All the other rangers were called away from their posts and had been working tirelessly for hours, trying to find whatever this thing or creature was that had attacked several people. Several? How many people did this thing attack? All my friends could tell you is that I was super quiet for the rest of the week and had some pretty weird things going on, like never wanting to be in the woods and always having my gun at the ready, seemingly over-paranoid. I know that whatever that was, it was real, and I can never forget what I saw that day on the riverbank. Hi, my name is Joe. I work for the Forestry Service in a small town located roughly about an hour or two away from both Reno and South Lake Tahoe. For the past few months, there have been reports of people seeing very large tracks around here, but up until recently, nobody thought much of it. We all assumed it to be bear tracks, since we do have a lot of black bears living around these parts. But lately, people are coming forward with stories about their own encounters with what might possibly seem to be a type of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or even Yowie type creature. We suspect these beings have been roaming around here at night, scaring hikers out on the trails, growling and howling at them, waking people up in their tents, and just causing ruckus. The first thing I thought when I heard these stories was that they were all total BS. Maybe we just got a few drunk college kids and they were trespassing, trying to scare people away. But then I started asking around town, and there's a guy around here who's been doing this his whole life, and he works as a paramedic. He informed me about seeing something large sprinting along the forest at what he estimated to be near 80 miles an hour, incredibly fast if you consider just how thick and how dense some of the timber is around here. His description of it looked similar to what these people are saying, and he seemed completely serious and not intending to prank or lie to anybody. He also said that it left a trail behind it, kind of like its eyes glowed so white that it left behind this light trail. We're talking about something almost otherworldly here. And this is one of the stories where you feel as if the person telling it thinks their audience is going to dismiss them as either a liar or insist they were either drunk, sleep deprived, or high on something due to sleep deprivation, which makes me wonder why somebody would make such an outlandish story up. Especially one like this, where they're seeing something like this running through the forest. Maybe there are people out here who are really seeing something potentially dangerous. I don't know what to think at this point, so I'll leave it up to you guys to do all the research. Hopefully we can figure out what's going on here ASAP, because these accounts about encounters keep getting more and more frequent, and there seems to be no signs of stopping. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I'm not sure if anybody else in my community has seen or heard anything like this before, but just in case, keep your eyes open. I was up on patrol in the mountains of New Mexico. I had hiked about 4 miles out of my way when I saw these prints. They were three-toed prints that looked very clear. At first, I maybe assumed they were bear tracks, but I got a closer look. They were too large to be an adult black bear. Right away, I thought, this might be something else. I was tracking these prints when all of a sudden, they stopped in what looked like an old dried-up creek bed. It had nothing around but sagebrush growing all over. It was really weird to see no other prints on the trail for a while, and then all of a sudden, these tracks just started up again, like whatever it was just levitated or ascended into the sky. I wonder if they were still fresh enough to have been made today. I couldn't tell. I kind of crouched down to see if I could smell anything, and radiating up off the tracks were this horrible, musty death smell that you could only smell if you got within a couple feet of the actual tracks. So I started tracking these from there, and it was clear that whatever this was had been going around in a route or a loop, backtracking. That's when I came upon this section of pine. A lot of the trees at the middle were broken and torn. I eventually made my way back down, called my buddy, and asked him, if he knew anything about what I had seen. And he tells me he has also been receiving calls about strange things going on in these mountains. I can't exactly say what this was made by, but I can tell you now that this was no black bear walking on two legs. This was something much, much different. We're up against something that we don't even know what it could be. This was actually back before I was a ranger. See, I had moved out of the area, which is where most of these encounters had happened, and about 2 months after, me and my family decided to go camping up in the same forest. The same area, by the way, the national park that I would later encounter many strange things on my job. This was a place where I used to play all the time when I was young. There were never any strangers or anybody else in these woods, so it wasn't unusual that we were going there for a weekend trip when we did. We hadn't been there for more than 30 minutes when my mother looked into the fire and said, "What's that? There's something in the trees." I immediately looked up, scanning, and saw a very tall, extremely skinny figure, its arms down to its sides, just watching us. It had these giant black eyes that weren't really slanted, but more rounded at the top and bottom part of the eye. It kind of reminded me of a giant insect. After about 10 seconds of a stare-off, my father began screaming to me and my brother in a loud voice, "Stop looking at it! Run!" Which, in retrospect, was probably the worst thing he could have done. Either he wanted us to look away, or maybe even run at the sight of this thing. But instead, I felt drawn towards it, not even afraid. For some reason, like I wasn't scared, like I should have been. I felt as if this thing put a trance on me, like I was off in another world while I was looking at it. The whole entire thing, the encounter, everything, was so strange. I remember the night being quiet, no crickets, and the entire time, it felt like time had slowed down, but sped up all at the same time. There's no way this could have been a human being. This was something else, entirely. I'm not exactly sure where this thing came from, but apparently, it had snuck up on us and had been watching us from the trees. We weren't properly paying attention to our surroundings, something I get after many campers for nowadays. My mother only ended up seeing it because of the movement of the light. This thing scared me, badly, and if anybody has seen anything like this before, please let me know. If not, then I'm beginning to think I've been seeing something that isn't there, or something that should not exist in the world we live in. I've tried to do some research on what type of animal this could have been, based off the sound, based off the size and speed. Nothing is seeming to match. I'm wanting to know what you think it might be. We had never heard of anything like this before in the woods, especially back then, let alone any of my friends who are all seasoned hunters, by the way. This thing let off a high-pitched scream, but with something so large, like an elephant screaming. Nobody knows for sure exactly. I've read a couple of theories about cougars apparently looking like this, but none that I've ever seen myself. I should also mention that there was hardly any coloration on this thing. I don't believe it was a bear. It was kind of brownish in color, but no real coloration. If anybody has any idea what type of creature we might be dealing with, please let me know. This memory has haunted me for a very, very long time. So I have quite a bit of stories to share with you. First, let me introduce myself. You can call me Bill. I used to work in the Ranger Services in North Carolina, back in the early to mid-2000s. This was one of the very first search and rescue cases I'd ever been on. We were looking for a missing hiker. We ended up having to go deep into the beginning of the Pisgah National Forest. In this section, it's really dark. There's a lot of woods and a lot of foliage, especially at night, when it is so dark and covered, even moonlight has a hard time breaking through. But it wasn't like anything had actually happened yet. We were pretty sure that this was just simply a case of a hiker who had gotten turned around and put in circles. We found him, luckily alive, and he claimed that there were others out there with him, and that he was not by himself. We asked him if he had been hiking with anybody else who had also gone missing, but that's not what he meant, that there were other things out there in the night. The other search and rescue guy with us claimed that he saw this large, ape-like creature stalking us. Apparently, it had long hair and a long whip lizard-like tail. The guy was fine, but still very, very creepy. Another story I have to share with you is from a good friend. His grandmother's from England, and one of my earliest memories of her is telling me about seeing Bigfoot. She was in the Scottish Highlands with her family, back around the 1920s. They were on their way to a local small town when she sees this creature. She said it was tall and covered in dark hair. Also, walked up like a wild, hairy man. She thought it was some farmer playing a trick, but soon realized, by the speed and power in which it moved, this was a real-life thing. Back then, they had no concept of a Bigfoot, but they knew they were real creatures, something that really lived. Although she kept referring to it as a wild, hairy man, and not a Bigfoot. I guess this Bigfoot creature chased after her, before nearly trying to kill the horse. Another story is told to me by another ranger who worked in the Smoky Mountains. He'd been assigned to one of the ranger stations way back behind the Cataloochee. He said it was a very slow night. He'd been in the station for about an hour, and he hears this deep, weird kind of coughing noise right outside, like something really big was trying to clear its throat of phlegm. He peeks out the window and sees what looked like a large Bigfoot, but standing up on its hind legs, looking right at him. My buddy didn't stick around long enough to see if it would come inside. That's one of the times where you wish you had your gun with you and ready to go. Alright, the final story I'll share is by far the most disturbing. I still get chills thinking about it. This happened to me while we were doing a search for some lost hikers. This was in West Virginia's North region. We had a helicopter support on this one. We were having trouble finding any sign of them at all. They'd been out there less than 24 hours. Things weren't looking that great. We had a few trackers with us, and they were always able to pick up on little bits of information that the rest of us had missed. One of us was going over the helicopter's footage when he said he saw something in the trees. We made our way over there to where he was pointing, and sure enough, this large snouted creature began picking its way through the underbrush. He said it looked at the chopper once before disappearing back into the woods, trying to stay out of the light. This thing started screaming this strange guttural language at us, and then kind of just vanished. That's easily the one SAR case I'll probably never forget. While I was on duty a few years back, we had to respond to a call about hikers that were late. It was pretty routine, just two young kids who had gotten lost where they were going. They were actually from out of state, so they weren't used to this terrain. We found them again before nightfall. They were pretty freaked out. They said they'd been hearing this weird noise coming out of the woods around them. They'd been scared into this spot, actually. They said the noise had gotten closer and closer, and was with them for most of the day. They didn't know what it was, but they were pretty determined to get out of there. We escorted them back to base, but I knew we were being followed the whole time. Something in the woods behind us was chasing them. It was staying just out of the light. I had my rifle on it the whole time, but I never saw anything out there. I know I heard something, though. It was breathing hard and making these strange noises. I kept looking behind me, but all I could see were silhouettes of trees in the sky. I didn't see what was making the noise until we were almost at the ops. When I found it, it was big and built low to the ground. Then it got down and began running on all fours, and it had a very featureless face, unlike anything I'd seen before. I don't know what it was, but I'm not sure I want to know. Another night, I was working the graveyard shift alone. We got a call over the radio that somebody had seen something large and unknown. We were all pretty tired this night. Most of us had been on duty for 20 hours already. The area this thing went into was a mix of densely forested and open fields. The guy who saw the thing said it kind of looked like a large black blur, moving through the field at an incredible speed. So my partner and I were looking down at the edge of the woodline, and we heard something come out near us. It sounded big, whatever it was. Very big. We switched with another team after about an hour. They had to go deeper, We took upon their first post, but my partner told me to go over a small hill, giving us a better vantage point on the forested area beyond it. As I'm walking toward where she told me to go, she gets on the radio and starts screaming at everyone to get out. She's yelling about how this big black thing is coming right at us, but I don't hear it. I finally see her come over the hill towards me, and she tells me this thing was chasing after us. She said it looked like a hairy large dog, large yellow eyes, but that it had legs just like a man, not hocks like a dog. It had caught up with her before she can get down the other side of the road, so she came back up here to avoid it. The rest of my team who had seen it were all white as sheets, especially my partner, who looked warmed over. None of them could really tell us what we saw, and we never really did find out, at least not from them. It was a heck of a night. I was told by my supervisor that the park ranger in the next district over had requested assistance. He had some sort of reports of something attacking people deep in the woods at nighttime. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, but I remember thinking maybe it's just a hunter mistaking an elk for a man. Although this notion was quickly dismissed because it was not hunting season. But I do know people hunt illegally, so I don't know. I was just trying to think of anything I could. So I go and meet up with the ranger, and we quickly get to work finding any evidence he may have missed. We split up to cover more ground. It didn't take long before dark started setting in. The forest soon became very ominous looking at night, one sure way from civilization. We were exploring different trails, and I hear a rustling. I called out to the other park ranger. No response. That's when I hear things breaking around me. Whatever it was coming closer. I decided it would be best for me to turn around to investigate what is in the woods. I turned around very slowly, looking into the darkness of the trees. There's nothing but thick timber all around. Everywhere you look, there seems to be darkness. But something big was getting closer and closer. And now I could begin to make out a shape. It was dark brown with black markings all over. And I see these orange eyes glowing brighter and brighter as it begins moving towards me faster until it stops. I couldn't make out the details, but it was big, having a row of spikes going down its back, like long spines. The way it moved, it sounded like metal scraping against metal. Then it kind of disappeared. I didn't see it again, but I knew it was around me. It's like it just wanted to make itself known, to let me know that it was there. So I quickly pulled out my service pistol, ready for this thing, although I never saw it. Again, but I could still hear it, probably about 10 feet off in the woodline, waiting, lingering, hiding in the shadows. The other ranger finally met back up with me, telling me he had a bad feeling. I explained to him that some large animal was trying to stalk us, and I believed it to be an unknown predator. He told me he'd believe me, and he'd felt the strange sensation of being watched and stalked. He was concerned that it was a very large mountain lion, but I knew based off what little I saw, it was actually something else entirely. I was just starting my shift for the night. The park closes at 10, and I'm done with the day. It was about midnight, and I was driving through the back roads. To get out of the park, there were no cars on the road heading towards town. The population is under 20,000. It could be considered by many a very small town. So I'm driving along, and I see something darting across the road in front of me. It looked like a big coyote, and then it turned its head, staring at my car as it ran towards me, with its eyes. I hit my brakes pretty hard, but it just kept kind of running off into the woods, each stride covering 6 to 7 feet. It was huge. It scared the crap out of me. I drove like a bat out of hell to get back to the station. There's no way it was some escaped big cat. We had none in the park that I knew of, or any other type of big cat. There's no way it could have been a coyote, fox, or anything else that I know of. It was just far too large. It was easily bigger than a Great Dane dog. And since then, I had seen it at least 3 different times over the following 2 weeks. It didn't act aggressive, but more of an eerie presence than anything. So even though nothing major happened, my experiences still leave me all shaken up inside. There was something else that another park ranger in Idaho had experienced as well. Now, his sister lives out on the prairie, and her family near the town in Idaho, which she refuses to disclose. She's about 25 miles south of Boise. She told us that there's some type of large black dog that she sees out near the prairie regularly, and it's freaking her out. She said that she could see its eyes in the nighttime, and it always seems to chase after her in the highway. Do you have any idea what sort of creature or animal this could be? Thank you. This is my experience dealing with a dogman while working as a Forest Service employee. This is something we're not really supposed to be mentioning, but I'm sure you hear that a lot. But I'm going to go ahead and remain nameless for the sake of this email. I hope you don't mind. Where to start, really? Well, when I first joined, I had not really knew of or dealt with a dogman, ever. I had heard it in passing through other rangers, but easily dismissed it as a legend of the Midwest, like Bigfoot is to the Pacific Northwest. This is, until one evening, a couple of years in, I would have my own terrifying standoff with one of these things. And let me tell you, they are far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. I don't recommend going out looking for them. They mean trouble. Fortunately for me, I'm already dealing with a career choice that puts me smack dab in the center of the woodlands, where these things are supposed to be living. Yay me. So my first encounter with these things were not out in the deep woods, like most people would expect, but rather on a popular trail that leads along the coast of one of our larger lakes. I was alone, something which I no longer do. I always travel with a partner. The sun had just dropped below the tree line. There would only be about a half hour left until darkness had set in completely. I wanted to ensure that all hikers and bikers were accounted for and home safe before then. I'd probably get my second wind when the sun went down and could keep going for another hour or two. But you know how these things go. While cruising through this particular stretch of trail, I saw movement up ahead and under a canopy of overgrown ferns. Now, I wasn't really expecting to see anybody for at least another hour, and hadn't seen a soul, so this was an eyebrow raiser. I stopped and creeped up on it slowly, carefully, my hand resting on my rifle. As soon as I get close enough, I realized what the movement had been. A mountain lion. But then I looked closer, and this thing was too big to be a mountain lion. But whatever it was digging into a fresh deer carcass, ripping through the meat. I could hear the flesh tearing, and so I shined my light on it and ordered it to leave, when I realized this was no means a mountain lion. This was some sort of really large, freakish-looking dog. Things escalated quite quickly. As this creature let out a guttural growl, it sounded like nothing what you'd expect from a big old kitty. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowly made my way backwards, trying to radio for help on my walkie-talkie. But of course, there was only static. It was dead silent out there, except for that low growl coming from somewhere behind me. It was beginning to get dark out, and I can't really say for certain, but as I made my way faster back towards the main trail, I could have sworn that Big Kitty's eyes glowed a deep red in my flashlight. Even though it wasn't a kitty, it was some crazy dog or something. But I'm just going to refer to it as a giant kitty for the sake of my sanity. My palms were sweaty, my knees all wobbly when I finally made it back to the main recreation area, where the rest of the campers had gathered for an outdoor movie. I must have looked like a ghost because everybody was staring at me with real concerned looks on their faces. Nobody wanted to believe me what I'd seen. But there was that deer carcass, which was almost certainly the mountain lion's kill, right where I'd found it earlier, confirmed by 2 other rangers who went out there to take care of it after they got my distress call. They said they found large canine tracks all around there. I could hardly sleep that night, thinking just about how close I came to being dinner for one of those things. I've had a few other close calls too and weird stuff, but I'll save that all for another time. Right now, I just want to sleep and forget about that thing out in the deep woods. So I hope you guys don't mind. This is going to be a relatively long post, so just bear with me. I'm not sure exactly if this is just maybe a strange coincidence, or if maybe it's something more than that. Maybe, just maybe, I'm dealing with something of the paranormal. I'll let you decide. Let me first give you just a little bit of background about me. I go by the name of Dennis. Obviously not my real name, but for the sake of this story, that's what you can call me. I'm from a pretty small town, surrounded by lots of woods, and the national park that I work at, well, I guess I'll just keep that under wraps for now. This occurred at roughly about 3 in the morning. I was on my ATV, and I began to hear strange animal sounds. Now, that's really strange for me because I'm pretty well versed in the animals that I know. I've heard it all. Mountain lions, bear, wild dogs, you name it. But the sound that I was hearing did not match up with anything that I'm used to hearing. So that was a number 1 red flag. And then the second red flag is I began to hear heavy, rapid breathing, like if something was drowning, the kind of sound. But it was much deeper, much more guttural, like it had this raspy quality to it, as if whatever voice it was not only large, but had smoked about 3 packs of cigarettes a day for the last 10 years. So as I'm sitting there listening to this, I think I should pull up my phone and start to record the noise. Well, I do this, and the breathing noise stops. Just everything abruptly stops. Not only the breathing noises, but even all the crickets around me just cease, and everything's quiet. Now I'm beginning to get a little unnerved, and I start to feel like I'm no longer safe, like something is watching me, but I'm not exactly sure what. So I kind of thoroughly check my surroundings, make sure I have all my equipment with me, because God only knows what this could have been. And that's when I start to speculate that I'm probably not dealing with a regular everyday animal. This might be something else. I hate to go into the whole it's paranormal, but I don't know. I've never dealt with these sorts of emotions and feelings from any sort of regular animal, at least none that I've ever encountered. I began feeling very uncomfortable. I figured it would just be best to get in my ATV and go ahead and get going. I'm still really clueless as to what animal this could have been. I had heard this story when I was back in college. I don't remember where it came from, but it's always stuck with me, due to the horrific descriptions of what this park ranger saw. I'm not really sure about the names or dates for this one. However, I can tell you that it happened at least 15 years ago, possibly longer. Though the older I get, the memory becomes less clear. A man, forgive me if his name escapes me, who had been a ranger for several years at this point, had talked about reporting seeing something absolutely bone-chilling while driving along late at night. It was dark outside, obviously, and there were no lights to illuminate the area in which he saw something he could not explain. He also mentioned about not seeing proper moonlight, thus giving him little chance to see what it was he had witnessed. He, however, saw enough to be able to tell the others about what was out there in the darkness. It wasn't until recently that this man told anyone of his sighting. He did not want people to say he was crazy or even lying. But at some point following the incident, one of his fellow rangers told him that the other rangers had reported seeing something similar while working in nearby areas along the road. None of them knew what they were looking at, but they all agreed it could not have been an animal known to inhabit these regions, bear, deer, etc. The descriptions given by each ranger even matched the description given by the first ranger, the only difference being which area they had seen the thing. What they claimed to have seen was a tall, dark figure that stood up on 2 legs, having no discernible neck. The head sat directly upon the shoulders, no visible ears or hair above its brow, and a long arm hung down just below its knees, while the other one reached to its upper chest, or so they described. The main ranger said it looked like something out of a horror movie. It made him so scared that he nearly lost consciousness just from seeing it standing there, not 25 feet away from him. That's just how frightening this sighting was for him. It didn't appear to show any hostility towards him, which is why he kept his distance. But at the same time, its appearance was more than enough to paralyze the man with fear. He drove off as fast as he could without looking back. Keep in mind, this was no misidentification. This is a seasoned outdoorsman. He's been around mountain lions, bobcats, bear, all other sorts of various wildlife. He knew what he was seeing was certainly nothing that he had ever seen before. The ranger was aware that whatever this was had to be something otherworldly. What he saw made him so scared, he never told another living soul about it, until many years later. It's also worth mentioning that this ranger does not drink, do drugs, or suffer from any mental illness at all that I'm aware of. He is a very well-spoken individual who would not say anything unless he really believed what happened to him was really the way it happened, as he described. If one person witnessed such an encounter, surely there are others, since these areas are also frequented by many people a day. I'm not certain if anybody else has seen something similar to what he is talking about, but if you do, please comment below on this post. I would love to know. I'm going to share a story with you from a few years ago, back when I was still a ranger. I don't know how many of you have been to Fall Creek Falls in Tennessee, but it's an absolutely gorgeous state park. It's well known for its waterfalls, but let me tell you something about the forest there. This was around 10:30 p.m. on a weeknight. I was working my shift, and I had to go out of service for about an hour to go and get some paperwork done. So one of the other rangers agreed to cover for me. It's dark by 9 p.m. in the summer at that latitude. It was pitch black when I began to drive out of the park. As I was driving out, I noticed several deer running alongside my truck. At first, it didn't really concern me. Fall Creek Falls is known to be home to the largest population of white-tailed deer in any state, east of Mississippi. Unbeknownst to me at the time, there had been also a lot of predator activity. They were beginning to become a nuisance. They had also been attacking local livestock. So, as I was driving down the scenic road, several more deer began running alongside me. They were keeping pace with my truck for a while, but eventually they peeled away from the road. I didn't think anything of it, and just kept on going. 30 minutes later, while I was stopped at a red light in town, a deer had run right up to the passenger side of my truck. It wasn't attacking me or anything, it just trotted along the bumper for a little while, then ran off into the brush on the other side of the road. I'm not sure how much of you know about deer behavior, but they typically don't act like this when they see headlights coming their way. They turn away and run from them. So what was happening here? Well, I didn't find out till later. But after seeing 3 or 4 deer running alongside my truck for 30 minutes uninterrupted, something else from the forest joined them, and it was pacing me. That's when I realized these poor deer had been being chased out and hunted by something. Of course, when this was going on, I didn't think too much of it. Deer are typically skittish, and they're not always comfortable around people, hence why this behavior was so bizarre. So for them to act like this means there was something else nearby. I really wanted to see what was making them act like this, so I kept driving towards the west side of town. The whole way, every streetlight I passed, I would try and look over my shoulder at the car behind me every few seconds to make sure it wasn't getting too close. So every time a deer ran alongside me or crossed in front of my truck, I'd start scanning the woods along the road for whatever was lurking in the darkness. I eventually got home without further incident and went inside to get some rest. The next day, I went back out. It turned out that one of the other rangers had found a dead deer on the side of the road near where I actually saw them running, right along with my truck. Judging by how much damage was done to the carcass, it looked like it had been killed by something really big, with very sharp claws and teeth. And we're talking bigger than a bear. I'll never forget what happened next. Well, roughly about 2 weeks later. I was finishing up work right around the same time, and another ranger had come up to me and asked me if I'd seen anything odd lately. He just said he came back from making his rounds, and he'd seen a tall, dark figure off in the forest to the left. I remember kind of chuckling and asking what he meant. He told me he tried to track it down, but couldn't find anything that matched what he'd seen. No bent down grass, nothing bedding down, no footprints, nothing. And so I told him what happened to me. We decided to stick around for a little while longer. Then we started talking about our favorite movies. Then we hear this loud howl coming throughout the trees. This howl was coming deep within the woods, but it did not sound like any animal native to Tennessee or even North America that we knew of. It sounded like some kind of cross between a wolf howl and a coyote yelp, mixed with a deep, guttural bellow. We heard it again a few seconds later. this time directly behind us, just on the other side. That's when we looked at each other, and both just started to slowly back away. I don't know how much you know about animal behavior, but when wolves or coyotes start howling like that, they're either calling out to their pack mates that they found food, or they're giving away their location so another member of the pack can come in for the kill. We kept moving back slowly, and as soon as we were far enough away to take cover, we got out of there. The next day, I went back to see the deer carcass, and it was even in worse condition. Huge jagged teeth marks all over, similar to what you might see on an alligator kill. This was no doubt in my mind, whatever had made these wounds wasn't some kind of wild animal. This looked like the result of something that was non-human, that had very, very large teeth. The incident at Fall Creek Falls isn't the strangest thing that's happened to me while working as a ranger for the state park, but I'll save that for another post. Hope you enjoy. Comment below if you want to know more.